The scream split the music as glass cracked underfoot, and I spun to see Ethan, staring at a fake text on Liam's phone, like it was gospel. Ethan said, "Tell me this isn't you." I tasted metal and panic and said, "It's a lie." Liam smiled like a magician revealing a trick and said, "Screens never lie." The room tilted, faces curdled, and my name curdled with them. Zoe touched my sleeve and whispered, "Breathe." I said, "Turn that off," but the clip kept looping, my voice stolen into someone else's mouth. Ethan stepped back, eyes bright with hurt, and said, "You swore you'd never do this." Liam lifted the phone higher like a torch. I felt the floor become ice and said, "I would never burn us." Someone laughed like breaking chalk. The music died, and trust shattered louder than the speakers. Rain stitched the porch as Ethan jogged down the steps, and I followed with shoes slapping wood like apologies. I said, "Please listen." He kept his eyes on the street and said, "You lied to me and to everyone." The word "everyone" hit like a truck. Zoe caught up and said, "The clip sounds spliced." I clung to that thread while thunder warned we were late to the truth. Liam leaned in the doorway, dry as a sermon, and said, "You should go home." I said, "You made this up." He shrugged like innocence and said, "Screenshots are stubborn things." Ethan flinched and wiped rain from his lashes. I said, "Trust me, not a file." He said, "Trust broke before the download finished." Inside again, the kitchen smelled like lime and spilled beer, and the clip played on loop from 3 corners. I said, "Pause it there." Liam said, "You wanted proof." Zoe leaned over the island and said, "Waveform jumps at the consonant." Ethan watched the counter as if it might confess. I said, "He edited my voice." Liam laughed and said, "Your voice did the work for me." My stomach fell through the floor as Windows buzzed with notifications. Ethan said, "I never thought you'd do this." I said, "I didn't." He said, "Then show me why it looks like you did." The room waited for a miracle I didn't have. Zoe pulled another phone and said, "I can scrub the audio if someone stops yelling." The living room hushed like a courtroom. Liam said, "Go ahead, prove math to feelings." I said, "Ethan, wait with me." He stared at the carpet, then nodded once like a life raft. Zoe said, "There's a clone stamp on the waveform." My lungs filled with lightning and I said, "Say it louder." Liam's grin cooled to stone. Ethan said, "If it's faked, why would he do it?" The answer scraped my throat before my mouth. I said, "Because he wants what I have." The house creaked like it understood. A chant rose from the hallway like smoke, my name folded into rumor, and the music tried to restart but died under it. Liam said, "People decide faster than code." I said, "Truth still loads." Ethan rubbed his temples and said, "I need a reason to stay." Zoe lifted her phone and said, "Found the splice." Relief cracked me open, then fear poured in behind it. Liam said, "No one cares by morning." I said, "I will make them care." Ethan met my eyes and said, "Show me." The party banged on the walls and I understood the war had started. Dawn pressed through thin curtains while the storm smell lingered, and I opened the old shoebox of keepsakes. Ethan said, "We built a map out of moments." I smiled at the ticket stubs and said, "We never needed a compass." Zoe said, "You two were ridiculous and brave." I remembered the freshman fair, where Ethan caught my falling sketchbook. He said, "If you drop again, I drop too." Liam laughed back then and said, "I'll film your victory laps, not your bruises." We ate cheap fries under sun-bleached flags, and swore to keep each other bold. I said, "We were a team before we knew the rules." The room breathed with quiet proof that love once felt simple. The memory shifted to the campus library, where silence rang like a bell, and dust made constellations. Ethan said, "Borrow courage like you borrow books." I whispered a plan for our first film project. Zoe said, "I can write the shot list and steal batteries." Liam rolled the dolly and said, "We chase light, not permission." We forgot lunch and time while storyboards took over the table. I said, if we fail loud. Ethan said, then everyone hears the music anyway. The lamps hummed, stacks leaning like spectators, and the night folded itself around our promise. I kept the rooftop night where the city glittered like open secrets, and the wind kissed our ears. Ethan said, tell me something true and hard. I said, sometimes I hide my best work because I fear losing it. He said, then I'll hold it with you. Zoe kicked a bottle cap into orbit and said, orbit is just falling the right way. Liam lay back and said, the stars are late to their own party. We laughed until the laughter felt like armor. I said, promise me we never let fear narrate. Ethan said, fear can watch, not speak. The skyline nodded like a witness. Another piece glowed like a summer postcard, the roadside diner with chrome shining like a second sun. Ethan said, your script reads like a heartbeat. I traced syrup on the table and said, your notes made it breathe. Zoe said, to victories measured in pie slices. Liam clinked a spoon and said, to the crew that doesn't quit. We traded confessions between jukebox songs and the server's jokes. I said, we are brighter together than the sign outside. Ethan said, then let's keep the lights paid up. The bell over the door chimed like a vow we all believed. The last anchor lived in the reign of our first premiere, tiny theater, big nerves, and bigger hope. Ethan said, whatever happens, we walk out together. I said, if they boo, we bow anyway. Zoe squeezed my hand and said, they will clap because we did the work. Liam adjusted the projector and said, no glitches, only edits the world can't see. The lights dimmed, and the screen lit our faces like prophecy. I said, we built this with trust. Ethan said, trust is the ticket no one can counterfeit. The applause arrived like sunrise, and for a moment, everything was true. The warmth of old memories cracked when Ethan ignored my call, voicemail echoing like a stranger's voice. I said, pick up, please. Silence stretched until it hurt. Zoe said, he's avoiding you. I walked past campus benches that once held our plans and now held only litter. Liam strolled behind, easy smile cutting deep, and said, friends drift when truth bites. I said, you planted the bite. He shrugged and said, they chose to believe it. My chest burned as I pressed redial again. Ethan said, stop calling. His words pierced sharper than static. I said, we built years together. The line ended with a click colder than winter. At the cafe where we once sketched dreams, the barista hesitated before handing me Ethan's usual order. She said, he told me not to give you his drink anymore. My stomach hollowed out. Zoe whispered, this is Liam's doing. Liam leaned on the counter and said, people set boundaries when they grow. I said, you mean when you poison? The hiss of the espresso machine was louder than my pulse. Ethan's laugh floated from a back booth, not for me but with others. I said, he was my brother. Liam said, now he's mine. The ceramic cup burned my palm though it was empty. The group chat that once sang with jokes now bloomed with silence when I typed. I said, anyone free tonight? No reply. Then a new thread formed without me. Screenshots slipped by mistake. Zoe gasped, they replaced you. My breath locked in my ribs. Liam appeared in the screenshot too, smiling with words. He said, they finally saw who matters. I said, I mattered first. The cruelest part was Ethan's emoji, simple thumbs up sealing my exile. I dropped the phone, screen cracking like trust. Zoe picked it up and said, this isn't friendship, it's theater. I whispered, and I've lost my part. I found Ethan by the campus fountain, the water louder than his silence. I said, look at me. He did, but his eyes were ice. Ethan said, I don't know what's real anymore. I stepped closer and said, me. I am real. Liam leaned on the railing and said, real people don't hide lies. Zoe said, you forged them. Ethan turned away, shoulders like barricades. I said, we can fix this. He said, Not if I'm the only one trying. His words sliced deeper than the chill spray. I reached out, but the fountain sprayed harder, drowning what I wanted to say. Night crept in as I sat on the bleachers, empty field yawning before me. Zoe sat beside me and said, "You still believe in him?" I said, "Belief doesn't switch off." She said, "Then it might break you." I rubbed the worn logo of our old team jacket, ghosts of cheers, echoing. Liam's voice carried from the field's edge, mocking, "Even shadows leave you when lights go out." I said, "You'll never erase me." He said, "I already did." Zoe gripped my hand tight as if holding me to earth. I whispered, "How do you fight a lie everyone loves to hear?" The night of the gallery show burned into memory, where Ethan's name glowed under a painting we made together. I said, "That's ours." Liam leaned close and said, "Not anymore." My pulse froze as Ethan smiled for cameras like he painted every stroke alone. Zoe hissed, "He signed your work away." I said, "Ethan, you know the truth." He said, "Do I?" The flashbulbs blinded me while Liam whispered, "Lies make better art than honesty." The crowd clapped. The plaque bore only Ethan's name, and I felt my heart hanging like a stolen canvas. Backstage, the air stank of paint and dust, heavy with betrayal. I said, "How could you let him erase me?" Ethan said, "He showed proof you never finished it." I shook my head, rage filling cracks. Zoe said, "He's manipulating you." Liam laughed low and said, "Funny how proof looks permanent when you print it." I stepped closer, eyes burning. I said, "You stole what we bled for." Ethan turned away, shame shadowing his face. Liam said, "Art belongs to whoever frames it best." My fists clenched as silence cut sharper than knives. The truth slammed harder when Zoe pulled me into a quiet corner, showing screenshots from Liam's laptop. She whispered, "He forged every file." My chest cracked open. I said, "Ethan has to see this." But Liam appeared, snatching the folder, and said, "Careful, secrets cost more than loyalty." Ethan arrived, confusion heavy, and said, "What's going on?" Liam said, "She's fabricating evidence to cover her lies." I shouted, "No, this is yours." Ethan's jaw tightened, torn between us, the lie and the truth at war in his eyes. The confrontation spilled into the courtyard, the night sharp with wind. Ethan said, "I don't know who to believe." I said, "Believe the years we built." Liam said, "Believe the proof you've seen." Zoe shouted, "That proof is poisoned." Ethan's hands shook as he said, "Both of you sound like enemies." I stepped forward and said, "He wants everything I love." Liam's smirk froze into rage and he said, "You don't deserve it." The crowd from inside trickled out, whispers turning the air into knives. My voice cracked. "Then let the truth judge us here." The twist landed like a blade when Zoe revealed the last card. She said, "Liam did this before, in his old school." Ethan froze as she held up a yearbook article, words screaming plagiarism. I said, "He's been rewriting lives for years." Liam lunged, voice cracking, "Shut up." But too late, the crowd saw. Ethan's eyes widened with betrayal deeper than mine. He said, "You were never my friend, were you?" Liam's silence was answer enough. My body trembled as victory felt hollow, because what broke could never be rebuilt. The storm broke inside me as Ethan finally turned to Liam with eyes full of fire. Ethan said, "You stole her work, her voice, her life." Liam smirked and said, "I only revealed who she really is." I shouted, "You revealed nothing but your envy." Zoe stepped closer, voice sharp, "The files prove everything you touched was forged." The courtyard pulsed with whispers as the crowd closed in. Liam laughed bitterly and said, "Proof doesn't matter when people prefer a villain they can cheer for." Ethan clenched his fists and said, "Then tonight you face the truth you buried." The confrontation cracked open like thunder as Ethan shoved Liam back, voice breaking, "You were my brother too." Liam steadied himself, rage boiling, and said, "I was your shadow." I stepped between them and said, You burned us for attention. Zoe cried. Stop before someone gets hurt. Liam sneered. Hurt is the only language she understands. My hand trembled, but I said, You never understood loyalty. The crowd gasped as Liam lunged again, but Ethan blocked him, voice ragged. You'll never touch her again. The storm inside broke as Liam snarled. You were nothing until I gave you an enemy. I said, I was everything until you made me a lie. Ethan shouted, Enough! His voice cracked the silence heavier than thunder. Zoe held up her phone again and said, Here, unedited files, Liam's fingerprints in every splice. The crowd leaned closer, light from their screens painting judgment. Liam's smile faltered for the first time. I whispered, This ends now. Ethan said, We end you with truth, not fists. The clash became unbearable as Liam roared, You'll all regret siding against me. Ethan stepped closer and said, No, we regret trusting you. My chest heaved as I said, You destroyed the one bond that could have saved you. Zoe added, You never wanted friends, only mirrors. The crowd hissed and pulled away, whispers turning into judgment. Liam's shoulders slumped for a breath, then rose with false bravado. He said, You'll remember me when you're alone. I said, We'll remember who you really are. The climax tore open as Liam's words collapsed under the weight of silence. Ethan said, We're done with you. I stepped forward, voice shaking, and I take back my name. Zoe held my arm steady and said, You're not alone anymore. Liam glared, teeth gritted, then turned his back on all of us. The crowd parted like a tide, murmuring judgment that clung to him like smoke. I whispered, This war cost us everything. Ethan's eyes shone wet as he said, Maybe not everything, truth survived. The night swallowed Liam, but the wound he carved stayed raw. Morning light cut through blinds like questions with no answers. I sat at my desk, voice raw, whispering, What's left of me now? Zoe placed tea beside me and said, The truth is still yours. I touched the cracked phone, scars glowing across the screen. Ethan knocked softly and said, I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm here. My heart stung with both fury and relief. I said, You let him erase me. Ethan lowered his head and said, I let fear erase my judgment. Silence held us tighter than words. Zoe said, Pain doesn't vanish, but neither does proof. By afternoon, the cafe felt foreign without laughter. I stirred coffee that tasted like ash. Ethan sat across, voice low. I failed you. I said, You believed his lie before my truth. His hands shook as he said, I thought I was protecting us. Zoe joined, eyes sharp. Protecting means listening, not doubting. I leaned back, bitter smile cracking, and said, Friendship isn't a contract, it's faith. Ethan said, Then I broke faith. People around us whispered. Phones in hand, our faces now gossip currency. I said, Then let them talk, we live in truth, not rumor. Evening fell as we walked, the empty soccer field, where echoes of our younger selves once cheered. I said, He stole memories, not just moments. Ethan said, Then we rebuild them. Zoe's voice trembled but steady, truth rebuilds slower, but stronger. I stopped at midfield, breathing the damp grass, and said, I don't know if I can forgive you. Ethan said, Just don't let this be our last chapter. Zoe placed her hand over mine, silent witness. The night breeze whispered like a warning that scars remain even when wounds close. Later that night, Zoe scrolled through feeds, comments slicing sharper than blades. She said, People love villains too much to let them go. I leaned against the window and said, Then I'll stop living for their applause. Ethan said, I'll help carry what's left. I turned and said, You can't carry what you helped break. His jaw tightened, shame heavy. Zoe said, Maybe scars speak louder than the lie. I whispered, Scars are reminders, not excuses. Outside, the city lights pulsed, indifferent to whether we healed or bled. The resolution came not with peace but with resolve. I stood before the cracked mirror and said, I lost my best friend to one lie, but I refuse to lose myself. Ethan behind me whispered, I'll spend forever proving I'm not him. Zoe said, proof isn't words, it's choices. I touched the mirror crack, tracing my reflection like a scar. I said, this scar belongs to me now, not to him. The silence that followed was heavy but clean, like a wound stitched without anesthetic. The past bled, but the future waited, unpromised yet unbroken. Morning came quieter than I deserved, and the city felt like a bruise that finally stopped throbbing. I spread the files across the table and watched truth line up like soldiers. Zoe said, we publish today or we never breathe right again. I said, I'm done asking lies for permission. Ethan stood near the window, as if sunlight could forgive him. Ethan said, let me sign my name to the correction. I said, you can stand beside it, not in front of it. The cursor blinked like a metronome counting out our courage. Zoe said, attach the raw audio, the edit logs, and the timestamps. I said, give them the receipts and the road map. Ethan said, tell them I believed a stranger over my own history. I said, you believed a friend who wanted my place. The email field filled with names that once felt like home. Zoe said, send it before you change your mind. I said, I'm not the one who changes. My finger hovered, then pressed, and the message left like a flare over dark water. Ethan said, I don't know if they'll come back. I said, I'm not waiting at the door anymore. I met Liam where silence collects, under the parking deck where the air tastes like rust. Liam said, you think an email saves your halo? I said, I don't need a halo, I need the ground. He leaned against a pillar, as if the concrete adored him. Liam said, they loved the story when I told it. I said, they'll love the truth because it stands without makeup. He laughed, but the laugh felt borrowed. Liam said, you always wanted to be the hero. I said, I wanted a friend who didn't keep a knife behind his smile. His eyes flicked and hardened like wet cement. Liam said, you took what I was owed. I said, I took nothing that wasn't built with my hands. He stepped closer until I could count the lies on his breath. Liam said, you'll forgive me one day because you need enemies more than friends. I said, I forgive myself for believing you were either. A siren moaned from the street, like a tired conscience. I turned to leave, and he tried one more time to set the scene. Liam said, say my name when they ask who made you strong. I said, strength doesn't remember the thief who broke into it. We met on the river footbridge where wind writes its own scripture on the water. Ethan said, I read everything, and I felt my ribs bend. I said, truth doesn't break you unless you were holding a lie. He gripped the rail, as if apology could be welded to metal. Ethan said, I can't fix what I erased. I said, stop trying to fix me and start fixing you. Birds cut low circles, like they didn't trust heights anymore. Ethan said, I missed your birthday because I trusted his edit. I said, you missed who I was standing in front of you. He breathed slow, like a man learning air from scratch. Ethan said, what do you need from me now? I said, boundaries that don't move when a rumor knocks. The river shouldered our words without judging them. Ethan said, if you never forgive me, I'll still guard your name. I said, guard your own so mine doesn't have to carry it. A jogger passed and the footfalls set a gentle tempo to our failure. Ethan said, I'll be where you need distance to be real. I said, then stand there and don't wave. The room filled with faces that used to know mine, and the projector hummed like a throat clearing. Zoe said, we walk them through every stitch, no drama. I said, only receipts and quiet knives. Ethan set up the timeline like a crime scene without bodies. Ethan said, this layer's where the voice bends wrong. I said, this is where I stopped recognizing myself. Murmurs rose and fell like unsure tides. A girl from the old group stood and said, I'm sorry I shared it. I said, you didn't share it, it used you. Another voice said, he told us you confessed. I said, he told you a script, and you gave it a theater. The waveform pulsed, and every cut surfaced like a scar that finally named itself. Zoe said, questions after, but hear the truth first. I said, I'll listen after you finish listening. The room grew still, as if furniture could hold breath. Ethan said, I failed her, and I failed you, and I will not ask the lie to forgive me. I said, I'm not passing a basket for absolution. The final slide was only a blank screen that reflected our faces back. Night folded the day into a smaller box than it started with, and I packed what survived. I slid the old team jacket into a bag and let the zipper close like a soft verdict. Zoe said, you don't have to leave the apartment tonight. I said, I want the first quiet to belong to me. She hugged me with the kind of care that doesn't ask for a receipt. Ethan waited by the door, not a guard, just gravity. Ethan said, I'll carry the heavy box, and then I'll go. I said, carry the apology and leave the box. We walked the stairwell where echoes used to cheer us home. The street met us with a breeze that smelled like rain choosing not to fall. Zoe said, text me when you land in your new place. I said, I'll send the name after I live there a while. A car passed and threw a ribbon of light across the sidewalk that didn't touch my feet. Ethan said, I hope one day your laughter forgets my name. I said, it already does between breaths. We reached the curb and set the boxes down, and the night did not applaud or boo. I looked at the door across the street and realized I was not picking a lock anymore. I was choosing a key I hadn't owned before. I whispered, the only line that deserved the last word. I lost my best friend the day I found out who he really was.